Welcome everyone to our workshop today on identifying outdated research notions. We are so excited to have you all here today for this and to have folks from coming from such a wide geographic range. It's really great. So my name is Jane Hammonds, and I am an assistant professor in the Ohio State University Libraries. I'm a teaching and learning engagement librarian. And you can email me at hammonds.73@osu.edu. Always happy to talk more with folks about information literacy concepts and research. And I'm very excited to be joined here today by two co-presenters. So I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves. Go ahead, Adrienne.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Warner. I'm an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico, and I have a couple roles. I'm a learning services librarian and first year experience librarian. And I'd love it if you want to get in touch with me. My email is adriennew@unm.edu.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lori, and I'm also at UNM. I am a learning services librarian, and I'm our assessment coordinator. And yes, happy to hear from anyone, lt@unm.edu.
Thank you so much. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking a little bit about some outdated research notions. So we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by that term in just a second. And we're going to think about how we might update some of the guidance that we may be providing to students and share a few strategies and resources that both instructors and librarians could use to help students move beyond any sort of outdated guidance that they have been given. So what are we talking about when we talk about outdated research notions? So basically what we mean here is guidance that has been provided to students or approaches to teaching research, approaches to teaching information literacy that are no longer really appropriate or relevant for how we teach research in the digital age. And potentially some of this guidance could even be harmful in that it could lead students to not being able to find the appropriate kinds of sources that they need, for example, or making poor decisions about whether or not certain sources are acceptable or not. So we wanted to mention that we know that we may not all agree that all of these are outdated notions. If there is something that we mention as an outdated notion and you disagree with that, that is totally okay. You are the expert in what works in your context. But we did want to start a conversation, share some ideas about, what we think about are some outdated research notions. I want to give a little context really quickly. The theme for this workshop and much of the content was inspired by an infographic that Lori and Adrienne and a few of their colleagues at the University of New Mexico developed on outdated research notions. And I'll put the links in the chat again one more time. And the link to that infographic should be there. And so they presented on outdated research notions at the Will You conference last May. And I attended their session and I asked if I could steal some of their content and use it for a workshop that I was planning for instructors on my campus. So the primary audience for most of the workshops that I do are instructors. And so I wanted to steal some of their content and use that. And that was the intended audience that had been for their infographic as well, was the instructor audience. So not necessarily the librarian audience, but course instructors and how we can get them to maybe rethink some of the guidance that they might be sharing with students. So keep that context in mind thinking about this. For those folks here that are librarians, but I think are probably most of the participants, that a lot of this content was originally geared toward an instructor audience. So you may want to think about how you might share or do similar kinds of workshops or create an infographic with instructors on your campus as well. So with that context, we will go ahead and jump in. Wonderful, Jill. I'm glad we do have some instructors. We did open it up to everyone, but I know we had a lot of librarian participants as well, which is great. We love all of the audience. Hopefully we have some graduate students here as well. So we really wanted to open this up to as many folks as possible. Absolutely. All right, so here's an example of what we consider to be outdated guidance. This guidance that print sources are more reliable than digital sources. So I picked a few examples here where you can find on the website of different libraries or different universities. The first one is on the Teaching and Learning Center website. where students are being told that internet sources are less reliable than print sources. Right. And so this is an example of something that we consider to be outdated guidance. Right. So thinking about this, is it really true that print sources are more reliable, or does this guidance actually help students thinking about doing research? Right. If we think about, the difference between a print book or an ebook, right? Uh, is one better than the other? A print newspaper versus an online newspaper, is one necessarily better than the other? And especially thinking about, this is the digital age. How many sources are our students realistically going to be encountering in print? Right. Most journals don't publish in print anymore. Some do, but a lot have moved completely away from print. Right. So it's not that we don't want students to use print books, but thinking about the reality of how research is done in the digital age, does giving students guidance that print sources are more reliable than online or electronic sources, is that really helpful? So we do know that medium may make it more difficult, right? Because it's harder to tell online what type of source it actually is. What is the difference between a newspaper and a magazine and a journal article online can be difficult to tell. So that's certainly important to keep in mind. But thinking about whether or not just telling students that print sources are generally going to be more reliable than online sources, is that really helpful guidance in this day and age? So that's what we mean when we have an example of an outdated research notion. So with that one in mind, we wanted to give you all a chance to think about what you might consider to be an outdated notion. So our question is, what is something that you were taught or something that maybe you have taught about research or information literacy that you think is no longer accurate or relevant? So we have a Padlet. I put the link in the chat there for the Padlet. Again, you should see that link there. We're going to go ahead and go out to that Padlet and give folks a chance to share their responses there. I can actually get out of here and go to the Padlet. All right, hopefully folks should be seeing the Padlet. So you can go down here on the lower right-hand side, you have a plus button, and that's where you can click to add your response to share your ideas of outdated research notions. We have lots of responses coming in. Definitely seeing some themes here. A lot of folks are mentioning the idea of Wikipedia, right? And that Wikipedia should not be used for research. Wikipedia is forbidden as being an outdated notion. So I'll mention that's not going to be one that we're going to be talking about today, but that is one of the original ones that is on the infographic that Lori and Adrian and their colleagues discussed. Some of the other ones that we're talking about, so the CRAP test, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, that a variety of sources are needed. Let's see, .org more credible than .com. Yeah. .org equals good. Web evaluation checklist. There are good sources and bad sources. Peer review is also the best. Peer review is an indicator of quality. Yeah, so several of the responses around here about peer review, only using peer review or requiring students to use peer-reviewed sources. Looking at internet domains, right? Libraries better than the internet. Yeah. Abstracts are good enough. There's an interesting one. Boolean operators. Yes. Preprints should never be used. Sources can be divided into popular or scholarly, and that's a useful division. You can't use social media posts. So I see a lot of comments, a lot of around guidance that have been given about what appropriate sources are and what appropriate sources are not. We see a lot of guidance in here about evaluation and strategies that students may have been taught for evaluation. I see a lot of responses around authority and what types of sources might be considered authoritative or not. So yeah, wonderful. Open access is less credible. That's a great response as well. Open access is not high quality. Wonderful. Sharp distinctions between subject encyclopedias, bibliography. Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much all for sharing your responses there. Great responses. So some of these we're going to be talking about today, some of these will not. Unfortunately, as we were going through and preparing, there was like no way that we could talk about all of the outdated notions that we wanted to talk about. So we highlighted just a few that we thought were the most relevant or the ones that we wanted to talk about. But definitely know that we recognize that these are by no means the only outdated notions out there. So the ones that we're going to highlight really quickly are just the ones about domain determining credibility, vertical evaluation checklist approach, talk about one about plagiarism, research as a linear process, and the requiring students to use scholarly sources. Right. So a few of the outdated notions. So this is one that several people had commented on the Padlet, this idea that domain determines credibility. And this idea that a lot of students have been taught and continue to be taught that they can tell whether a source is credible by the domain, and especially this idea that they've been taught that .org sources are good sources and .com sources are bad sources. And you can still find this guidance on various websites, library and university websites across the country. And we know that it's guidance that students have really taken to heart, right? There's been research, for example, Weinberg and Ziv, who did some research, right, looking at, students have taken this to heart, and they say, oh, if it's a .org source, it must be a good source, right? Or if it's a .com source, you can't use it. I've heard students tell me this. I've heard instructors that I've worked with tell me this as well, right? So this guidance really kind of sunk its teeth in strongly with a lot of folks, right? Of course, we know that anyone can get a .org site. It doesn't have to be a not-profit organization. Even if it is a nonprofit organization, that doesn't mean that it's a credible organization. We know that .com sources can be perfectly credible sources. The homepage for most academic journals is .com. Such guidance also usually ignores .us domains, and so students may not have anything idea what to do with those kinds of domains and may just ignore them. Right. So basically, this idea that telling students that they can determine credibility by looking at domain, we consider to be an outdated research notion, and we think, based on the response that you all shared as well, that a lot of you agree with that one. Closely related to that, of course, is this idea of vertical source evaluation or checklist evaluation approaches, such as the CRAP test. So I know a lot of the librarians in the group will be familiar with the CRAP test. For those of you who may not be, the CRAP test is an evaluation checklist that asks students to look at currency, relevance, accuracy, authority, and purpose as they evaluate sources that they find online. A lot of the guidance encourages students to do things like look at the appearance of a site, whether it looks professional or not, whether the site has links or references, focus heavily on what the About Us section of the website says, right? So that kind of guidance. Of course, we know that in this day and age, that guidance is not going to be very helpful. An organization can put whatever they want on their About Us page, and it's not going to, they can lie. No one's going to tell them that they can't, right? And so if students think that what's on that About Us page is credible, then that can really lead them wrong. Same thing with links and references. Just the presence of links and references in an online source or any type of source really does not necessarily mean that it is a credible source. And then appearance as well. Anyone can make a really great looking website, right? So guidance that may have been helpful in those early days of the internet, no longer helpful or relevant. And I again think, based on the comments that you all had, that you all would agree with that. Another one, and this one might be one that perhaps is a little bit more controversial to folks, but this idea of teaching plagiarism as theft. So these are some images that I picked. These are Adobe stock images that I found where I just put in plagiarism, and this is what comes out. And it really highlights this idea that a lot of times when we talk about plagiarism, we talk about it as theft. And I think that this is an outdated notion. I think that it doesn't really help us in teaching students about plagiarism and about academic integrity. It sets us up as the plagiarism police and puts students in the position as being criminals, right? And I think that this framing of plagiarism as theft really creates the very significant anxiety that a lot of students have around plagiarism, right? because they don't think of they're not criminals, right? And they don't want to be thought of criminals. But if you tell them that it's theft, then that's the mindset that we're going to have. So I think that this kind of framing really sets up a negative way of presenting and talking about plagiarism with students that is not really helpful. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about all of those in a second, of kind of updating those notions a little bit. But I wanted to go ahead and hand it over to Lori to talk about research as a linear process.
Yeah, research as a linear process. So there is this idea that we can give students step-by-step guidance for a research process. And as I put here, we don't have a path to follow. We build the path ourselves as we go along. And typically it's not leading to an end destination, but it's this representing this ongoing process of learning and communicating. So we leave a path, right, as we research, but it's certainly not a straight one or a clear one. And I think there has been this metaphor lurking in the back of my mind about researchers sort of following this path towards the top of a mountain where knowledge lives and going, whew, we're finished. And the reality is probably more like a free climb up the side of a mountain without a set route. And it's a balancing act where new information pushes us forward and our skills act as climbing acres and harnesses. And when we get to the top, there's another mountain waiting for us. So the culmination of research assignments or any kind of research is always a waypoint in a longer journey. Next slide. So that complicates the metaphor. But in the real world, how do we often represent the research process? With a set of steps. 3 steps here, but it could be more. And these steps represent a tamed version of a research process, a set of tasks to accomplish, which is actually fine. But this representation is, in another way, fundamentally inaccurate. There's no indication that starting research is the hardest part for our students, where they feel a sense of risk in choosing a topic that might fail, which means the beginning is full of anxiety and uncertainty, so a steep climb, or that they struggle to ask good research questions and move past that basic reporting of information. We also know that the research process is recursive and often leads to dead ends. There are a lot of choices to make throughout, and sometimes we have to regroup and try a different direction. So this simple linear set of steps hides a lot and can discourage students who think they are doing it wrong when it doesn't actually work like this in real life.
Okay, I'm not next. So here's an outdated notion. I'd love to know what you all think. Requiring students to use scholarly articles and assignments helps them understand scholarly articles. So because they're so dense, we might think that exposing students early on in their college careers to these texts will better prepare them for future classes or schooling. We might have heard that students are unprepared to deal with scholarly articles when they get to our class. And so we hope that colleagues who have them earlier will teach them better about scholarly articles. But for students, difficulty of scholarly articles might overshadow the information that they contain. And I'm sure we can all probably agree here that scholarly articles are difficult to read. They're dense and complicated and steeped in all of the disciplinary conventions that are hidden, and they're written by researchers for researchers. But librarians and reading experts have studied students' interactions with scholarly articles. They found that several conditions impact student learning with these materials. And one big one that you might not know is that the scholarly landscape has changed so much in the last several decades, and not just with the invention of Google and Google Scholar, but compared with the time when many of us, I'm assuming, were undergrads, the articles in scholarly journals now are more abundant, written for more specific and decidedly non-student audiences, longer and more complex than they were in the past. We also know that regarding their credibility, I think we saw this in the Padlet, we know that they're not always as ironclad as they're made out to be, with issues in reproducibility and misleading abstracts. And compounding all of this, there is no mandate in higher education to teach reading once students leave high school. So students use coping mechanisms to deal with difficult texts. Pamela Howard and her colleagues note, students' lived experience with academic reading suggests that they deploy a number of strategies other than deep and critical reading to meet their academic and problem-solving needs for learning. So in other words, students are using scholarly articles to meet the requirements in their assignments, but not necessarily to understand the broad strokes of research in a discipline. This suggests to me that teaching articles now to better prepare students for future use, which is also known as learning transfer, is not likely to occur in a meaningful way.
All right, so we're going to have a quick pause here. So I know we've had tons of comments come in and a few questions. So if you have a question, please go ahead. You can share that now. Get in the chat. We'll try to answer a question or two here. But I also wanted to thank everyone. Folks have been responding and answering to other folks' questions, which is so great, and sharing resources. So please do take a look at the chat. There's a lot of great resources in there. Lori or Adrian, did you notice any questions specifically as they were coming through that we wanted to respond to?
I didn't see anything. I was trying to look. It's moving pretty fast. And I do think there was definitely some folks maybe not agreeing, which is good, because some of the stuff is provocative and it's not necessarily universally accepted. Oh, there we go.
So a comment came in from Sarah. How to communicate with faculty, read scholarly articles notion.
And there's also a Q&A in the Q&A, the same general question: gently persuade faculty away from requiring peer-reviewed material.
Yeah, so Adrian, did you have any comments that you wanted to share?
I think it's an uphill battle, right? Like, just in my little recon efforts that I've been doing at conferences and around campus, like, I think it's a pretty entrenched thing that research equals scholarly articles. And I think even just bringing up this issue and raising it with faculty or instructors in general is a good way to start a conversation. And hopefully when we get to the updating these outdated research notions, you'll get a few more ideas on some different ways you can potentially approach this with folks on campus.
And I think one potential idea could also be, so if you do have an opportunity to work with the instructors, like if you try to do a workshop like this with instructors, I always have done in the past, had instructors try to read articles in a discipline that is not their own. And that takes them back into that student mindset of recognizing how challenging it is to read an article when you don't have the disciplinary knowledge. And so that might give them thinking a little bit about, whether or not reading scholarly articles, and we're not saying that they should never read scholarly articles, but, do I really need to have my first year students reading scholarly articles, in this discipline? So getting them into that mindset of understanding how challenging these articles really are, because that's something that may have just become internalized to them. They're so used to reading scholarly articles, they don't realize how hard they are anymore. Let's see if we have any other questions. So when can a student be expected to understand scholarly articles for information? Adrian, did you have any?
It's a very good question. I think as I'm thinking about this more, maybe upper undergrad, but I'm not even entirely sure about that. I think what we can hope for is that they understand some parts, right? I'm not going to ever expect a senior to understand the whole methodology section of biology article. So I think there's some things we can let go of them understanding. And I don't want to make the assumption either that once people get to grad school that they know all of this suddenly. Maybe they were taught a little bit in undergrad, but I don't think we can start first year grad school even with just an assumption that folks are coming in with this. Yeah, so I think the best is maybe starting with small understandings from scholarly articles, not entirety.
I'll also add that I think when we talk about this, at least at UNM, we're often talking about them reading scholarly articles in very early courses, and they're reading articles, they're in a discipline for which the instructor actually isn't in that discipline. And so like in English comp or sort of transitional courses. And I think that that's particularly problematic. Scholarly articles are fine once you get into a major and you actually offer support for that reading, the more deliberate things. A lot of people have commented on the kind of deliberate strategies they have for teaching students about scholarly articles and how to read them. There was also a really interesting comment disagreeing with the plagiarism as theft thing, but it went by very fast, and it was talking about AI and theft. And I thought that that was a wonderful point.
Yes, and absolutely. And feel free to put that comment again if you would like. Because yeah, I didn't see that one go by. Lots of comments going fast. So someone had mentioned talk about social annotation really quickly, and that's just a method that you can use with students where they can together read the same article and add comments and questions to the article as they're going through. Hypothesis is a tool that a lot of folks use to do that, but there's other social annotation tools as well. So I'll just mention that really quickly. All right. So I know that we want to make sure that we have time to get through the rest of the presentation. But please continue to add your comments in there and your questions in there. And we'll try to address as many as we can as we go through. All right. So we wanted to share really quickly some updated notions. So taking some of the ones that we've been talking about and thinking about how we might approach teaching them. So we talked about the checklist approach to source evaluation. In place of that, we recommend the lateral reading approach. And some folks were sharing in the chat as well about SIFT, which is a similar concept, connected idea to the lateral reading idea. But this idea that students are not evaluating sources by looking deeply at the source itself. Instead, what they are doing is they're going out and looking at other information. So they're opening other tabs, they're looking at Wikipedia, they're Googling the source, right? And so they're going out and finding out what other people have to say about that source, finding out information about the authors, the creators. So they're not trusting what the site says about itself as part of the evaluation process. And again, that's really closely connected to the SIFT idea that some folks have mentioned in the chat. Stop, investigate, find other information and trace claims. And that was developed by Mike Caulfield. Folks are interested in learning more about that. I know there were some links in there in the chat as well. But basically, the key idea is moving students away from this idea that you can use just the source itself to evaluate the source, right? And thinking about putting that source within the context of the broader conversation that is taking place and the broader information universe. So there's our first updated notion. So thinking about the comment about plagiarism as theft. That is definitely a tricky one. And there are cases in which plagiarism is theft. But for the most part, plagiarism is not considered to be an actual legal violation. Now, it does get complicated when we get into copyright and copyright infringement and that kind of issue, intellectual property. But for me, my reason why I discourage folks from talking about plagiarism as theft is I just don't think it's really helpful framing, and it creates that situation where it creates that students are the criminals kind of barrier. So I encourage folks to avoid talking about plagiarism as a crime, and instead to really try to acknowledge the complexities around plagiarism. And it's becoming more complex, right? With AI, knowing what plagiarism is and what plagiarism is not easy, right? We sometimes make it seem like it's pretty obvious, and it really is not the case at all. Is using Grammarly plagiarism? Technically, at my university, it is in some ways, but I don't necessarily agree with that. But we'll move on. But it's a really complex topic. So instead, I emphasize an approach where we talk about the value of citations as part of the research process. For example, I've had students do an activity where they read an article where all of the citations have been redacted. And you can redact citations with Adobe really easily. And then we talk about, okay, what is missing from this article when we don't have citations? We can't go out and find the additional information. Right. So I try to emphasize the value of the citation rather than thinking about plagiarism as an approach to as punishment. Right. Being very transparent in our expectations for source use, allowing students to share their fears and anxieties around plagiarism. I've had students do this assignment several times, and they really have a lot to say about plagiarism and citations. And And then, if you're in a situation where you can allow for functional citations, is it really necessary that students have perfect APA citation in your class? Or is it really necessary that they have perfect MLA citation? Maybe it is, but are there cases when it's okay if they just have a title and, a name and a link, and that's all they need? So are there situations in which functional citations may be allowed? Keep in mind, your institution is going to have a policy about academic integrity, and you may not want to violate that policy, and that's okay. But if you're in a situation where you can take a more empathetic approach, that's what I recommend when I work with instructors.
Okay, so research is inquiry. In this conceptualization of the research process, we have three broad areas moving along simultaneously. First, there's inquiry with curiosity and exploration. This is going on throughout the research process as students learn new information and ask new questions. Next, we have learning about, which is where students are taking in new information and using it to make arguments, find solutions, reconsider or reframe their research questions. And finally, we have communicating, and this can be writing or speaking or the production of other media. This starts at the very beginning when students are taking notes as they read or brainstorm topics and continues through to the end. A lot of this writing might not be included in a traditional research assignment, making this work invisible. So the communication area culminates in writing a paper or making a speech or some sort of research product. So notice how our language has shifted to highlight the broad purposes behind the research assignment. In this model, all of these elements are included in this sort of ribbon with an arrow. I'm not a graphic designer, which is meant to show that there is a sense of motion. And next slide. Here, the arrow, still containing all of these elements, is moving through the research process, kind of all over the place, and acknowledging that this is completely normal. This doesn't even show everything, all the starts and stops and the barriers that cause the adjustments. It just shows that the path of learning is not straight. And so we don't expect the research process, which is in the end a process of learning, to be straight either. Next slide. So, concrete recommendations. What can we do to support this understanding of the research process, which is one that we are all aware of, but maybe we don't necessarily communicate it to students? So allow students to dwell in the exploratory phase. Help them ask lots of questions and figure out which ones work well. Support curiosity with assignments that encourage browsing and creativity. A great approach in this phase is something called the question formulation technique. So focus on continuing the development of questions throughout the research process. Only develop a thesis after students have acquired a working knowledge of their topic. Give students credit for and allow them to share their meandering research process through assignments like research notebooks or question maps. And then finally, give students some boundaries for their topics, narrow the scope. The traditional write about something you find interesting can sometimes feel like too much for students. You can still allow that, passionate student who's really motivated by a personal interest to pursue that interest, but most students will appreciate a narrow scope from the beginning.
Okay, so now we'll talk about updating that outdated notion of assigning scholarly articles. So I'd invite you to consider focusing on current information needs. This is in response to the argument that we need to expose students earlier and earlier on. So the first step I would invite you to do is to just consider, if you are assigning these, like, get to your why. Like, maybe you have really good reasons for assigning these when you do, and you're clear on that. But if it's a little vague, or it's like some future use, or you're just wanting to help them, or you're exposing the hidden curriculum, I would invite you to consider if that's really meeting your students' current needs. So we've seen a little bit of this in the chat, but we as librarians would love to see instructors requiring students to use more magazine newspaper articles. Some of you mentioned podcasts. And even I saw a couple of comments on assigning a magazine article and linking that to the scholarly article that it was based on, which is exactly what Science News does. So it presents a magazine article, or it is a magazine article that talks about a really in-depth, detailed scholarly research project in a way that students can find really graspable. Let's see, so for early undergraduates, experience with with scholarly articles can be really untethered. They're not in a discipline often, they're taking gen ed classes. Maybe they are in a discipline themselves, but they're in a class of many other disciplines. So we really need to be careful in these situations if we're assigning scholarly articles. In all my research on this topic, I have not yet found a study that provides an evidence-based rationale for using scholarly articles with early undergrads. Most of the articles are about later undergrads or even grad students. But we know that folks are in their gen ed classes, and we know that scholarly articles are heavily dependent on disciplinary norms that these folks just don't know yet. And I think it's a burden to kind of expect them to start learning these before they're in a discipline. And I understand there may be this feeling of like, oh, well, Adrian's just like underestimating students' abilities, and we need to set really high expectations early on. And I have seen like some really amazing undergraduate research projects that cite articles, but let's go back to what the reading experts tell us. They say that reading is developmental, right? And when we think about little kids, this makes a lot of sense, right? But reading is actually developmental from early ages all through adulthood, and this includes academic reading. So they say reading comprehension, including academic reading, matures on a continuum along which knowledge, experience, and motivation play key roles. So put another way, if I've just taught someone how to drive a car with an automatic transmission, I can't expect them to automatically go over and drive a stick shift, right? Without a lot of extra instruction and guidance. Slide, please. Okay, so here's some like strategies, and I see that several of you already are employing a lot of these, so awesome. So if these are new to you, that's also great. So please, as librarians, please split up the tasks of searching and reading. So if you want students to go to the library website and find an article, that's great, but then also talk to them about how to engage with the article. So you can add a bunch of context around why you've chosen the things that you've chosen. This can show up as a sentence or two next to every required reading in your syllabus. You can show a video of the author talking in class. There's tons of ideas there. But you can also, I know it's hard to print copies for every student in your class. If you can do that, even just one time, so you can all mark up a physical copy together, that can be really approachable. But if you can't, we talked about social annotation, we talked about different tools in the chat I saw going by, Hypothesis and Word Online and Zotero. So there's a bunch of different ways that everyone can get in there and start creating a dialogue on the piece itself. But also I would encourage you to read together. As an instructor, read parts of articles out loud and voice what you're thinking, what connections you're making, what questions you're asking, what you're remembering about this person when they presented, at a conference. This is showing students have like the connections that are necessary to make that experience deeply critical and meaningful for them, right? And then finally, like also just talk about the disciplinary norms that you're seeing as evident in this article. Biology may have a shorter introduction than sociology, like where do the citations, where are they heavily formed in the article? These are just some ideas that you can use so that you can start to help students climb up that ladder and give them more practice really with these difficult texts. So once you get really clear on why you're assigning these, it enables you to get better on how you're teaching these. All done.
So thank you all so much. We've got a few more suggestions that we're going to share really quickly, and then we'll try to get some questions. We do encourage folks, if you have a question you would really like us to answer, to please put that in the Q&A instead of the chat so that we'll be able to see that a little bit better. But please continue sharing. It's been great to see so many people responding to each other in the chat and sharing resources there as well. We want to have a few more things to talk about really quickly, and then we'll try to get to some questions. So some resources really quickly. this there. So how do we identify outdated notions that our students might have? So these are a few examples of activities that I've done that I find really helpful for identifying misconceptions that students might have. And these are quick and easy activities that you can use, whether you're an instructor, whether you're a librarian. They should work in all different kinds of teaching contexts. Sounds really basic, but I love true false activities. Just give students or give instructors a list of 5 statements, 6 statements related to whatever topic that you're talking about, evaluating sources, peer-reviewed sources, plagiarism, whatever the topic might be. A statement could be peer-reviewed sources should always be considered credible, and have them say whether they think that's true or false, right? And I would have students work on these in groups. I would make them kind of a little bit, some of them were a little bit difficult where it wasn't always clear what the right answer was, because that would lead to an opportunity for conversation. But that would be really helpful in identifying, oh, a lot of students said that this was true, but it's false. Let's talk about this, right? Brainstorming activities. So I would do this a lot when it's talking to students about a source evaluation. I would just get up there and I would go to our whiteboard and say, okay, tell me all the things that you look for when you look for credible sources. And they would start talking about .org, and they would start to talk about these kinds of things. And I would write everything down that they said, and then we would talk through it together. And we would highlight, okay, here's some things that maybe are not that relevant. Self-explaining activities. So whatever you can do to get students to tell you their thought process can be really helpful for identifying any misconceptions that we might have. In one class that we teach, we have students do screencasts of themselves doing a search and describing what they're doing. And that allows us to really quickly see, okay, this is where a lot of students are going wrong. And we can kind of highlight that and start talk about that. Or giving students research scenarios that they have to respond to. How would you go about doing this? Would this approach be effective? And having students talk through some of those. So I think that those are the kinds of activities that you can do that are really quick, but would allow you to highlight some of the outdated notions or some of the misconceptions that students might have. And then you can start to address some of those more explicitly when you're talking to students. So we shared, and I'll share in the chat again one more time. I've got it still. The infographic that Lori and Adrienne and colleagues created at New Mexico. But you could provide students with this example, or if you're working with instructors, provide instructors with this example. Have them investigate some of these, have them respond to some of these. They could create their own updated infographic. Here's our updated guidance on what we could do here. You could have, your class version of an infographic that they all work together to create. But that could be a really fun activity for addressing some of these, and it could work with different kinds of audiences in different formats. And again, if you do work with instructors, or you're interested in doing like a workshop or something like this with instructors, or creating a resource like that with instructors, we encourage you to do that. Update the script. So this is a similar kind of activity. This is one I did several times with class students, and they always loved it. So I would share this video of Cookie Monster in the library. I don't know if folks have seen this one. It's fairly old by now, but Cookie Monster goes into the library, and the librarian tells him, all we have is books, only books. That's it. He asked for cookies. No, we only have books, right? And so I would ask students to update the script to what an actual academic library looks like today. What kinds of resources are there? What could Cookie Monster actually find if he went into a library? And they would talk about, and he probably could have a cookie there because there's probably a cafe in the library, right? And students loved this activity, and it was really, it was always so much fun to read their responses. So any kind of videos that you have, if you have old videos that you created yourself as a library that you think are outdated, share those with the students and have them update that script themselves. So I think that could be a cool way to address some of the outdated notions that students have. So next steps, for those folks in the audience that are librarians, we want to encourage you to review your website to find examples of outdated notions that are still on those sites. There's a lot of guidance still out there about using .org sources, for example. So check your websites to see if that guidance is still out there. Consider developing your own version of an outdated notions infographic to distribute on campus. Consider offering your own outdated notions webinar for instructors on your campus. If you are interested in doing that, I collaborate frequently with other librarians to give workshops, and I would be happy to collaborate with folks. So you can feel free to contact me if you're interested in doing that. For the instructors out there in the audience, we encourage you to review your assignment descriptions for any active examples of outdated guidance that you might be sharing. Reconsider your requirements for requiring students to use scholarly sources. We know there's been a lot of discussion about that guidance. And again, you know what's best in your context. So, no one is required to take any of our recommendations. But, it is something to think about whether you're requiring sources to use scholarly sources just because, or whether there's a really specific reason why you're doing that. You could potentially talk about outdated notions at a department meeting. Maybe bring a librarian in to your department meeting and talk about outdated notions with them. So those are just some of the next steps that we wanted to share. So we may get some questions and comments here. We'd love to hear, folks, if you have a key takeaway from this workshop that you would like to share. We'd love to hear what folks are going to be taking away from this. And again, questions that you have, you can go ahead and add those to the Q&A, and we'll try to get to those in just a second. We'll mention really quickly, if you're an Ohio State person, workshop today does count as attendance for the Teaching Information Literacy endorsement. For those non-Ohio State folks, this is basically a credential that Ohio State folks can get for learning about information literacy. If you're interested in doing something similar on your campus, please go ahead and send me an email. I'm happy to tell you more about that. And we do have a post-workshop survey. And again, I'll put that in the chat one more time. Hopefully, folks, that should be the last one of those links on there should be to a survey. So we'd love to hear your responses there. All right. And we do have our references and resources on all of that in there as well. Some upcoming workshops if folks are interested in that. All right. So we'll try to get to some questions really quickly. So one question that we have is Aaron asks, has anyone had success creating some kind of toolkit for faculty with these lesson plan suggestions? Where does that live and how is that updated? So if other folks have responses for Aaron, I would love to hear your responses. Aaron, I will share at Ohio State. I'm going to go away from the presentation for a second. At Ohio State, we do have a site that is called Instructor Resources. Really quickly. Instructor Resources at University Libraries. And I'll share the link to the chat here in a second. Where am I going here? Sorry. Got off track. Should have had this link ready to go. Sorry about that. There we go. I miscopied it again. I keep pasting. Instructor Resources at University. I'll put it in the chat in a second. But on this site, you can see we have a lot of guidance here on teaching research and information literacy, on search tools, research questions, types of information sources, source evaluation. And we have also Carmen course modules. So Canvas Carmen is our LMS. And so instructors can request pre-made modules that they can download into their class. So this is one example of a site that we have that might be helpful for folks to look at if you're interested in developing something like that. Any response to that question, Lori, Adrian, that you would like to share?
Sorry, I was answering some stuff in the chat.
That's okay. Yeah.
Same.
All right.
So not the chat, but in the questions.
Other questions that we have. So any suggestions for motivating faculty to move away from requiring first-year students to cite scholarly articles?
I think it depends, right? Like it depends on your context, it depends on the instructor, it depends on their discipline, and it depends on what the first year course is, right? I get asked a lot to visit first year seminar courses and explain scholarly articles. So pushing back a little with your instructors, it depends a lot on your relationship with that instructor, if that's going to be something that they can sort of have a dialogue with you about. Because I get asked to do this so much, and I really think that there's so many better ways to use library time and to find sources. I am considering not supporting those requests because I don't believe in them. But if you work with your instructor to look at assignments, like ask for the first assignment in the course that asks students to cite a scholarly article or whatever. See if you can work with them to kind of sneakily redesign like the sources that they're requiring. Like, for example, that science news idea would be a perfect thing, depending, of course, on the discipline. But if you can sort of do some structural changes, like in the assignment, or scaffold something for that instructor early on, and not just say, well, don't use these, which probably is not what you were planning on doing anyways. But I would say probably where I've been most successful with this is to work with the assignment, because that also takes it out of the personal realm of like, oh, well, why are you assigning this? It's like, well, let's work on the assignment together and see what can be best for students. That's just one idea.
Thank you, Adrian. And Glenn also shared in the Q&A that grad students can be sometimes pretty receptive. Grad instructors, so graduate teaching associates, can be kind of receptive to that guidance since they're often the ones that are working with early undergraduates. So perhaps doing some train the trainer kind of work with the graduate assistants could be another approach if that works at your particular context. Are there other questions that we are seeing in the chat that we would like to try to answer?
There was a question about a toolkit for faculty and have people, and I thought that was interesting. We don't have anything really like that. We have some guidance, but I find that to be a really useful suggestion for people to think about developing. And it might even be something that we could think about more broadly in our discipline about developing something that is a toolkit for faculty. But Jane has more, I think, experience with that, and you have your examples here. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you're interested in this page, most of the resources should be available to anyone on this page as well. Let's see, other comments coming in. So I noticed one person had put in the chat that this is very affirming, which I was really happy to see. So, if you have been, worried and like, is it right for me to stop teaching this? We think it is. So go ahead and do that. And yeah, we totally understand if there are things that folks did not agree with. We did want to be a little bit, provoke some discussion. But again, we know that you're the expert in what is going to work in your context, for sure. One question in the Q&A was about the difference between two of the links that I had shared. So one of the links is to this page here, the teaching research. This is just a general site where anyone can go to find information about teaching information literacy. The other link that a person was asking about, Melissa was asking about this here. So as I mentioned, at Ohio State, we offer what we call an endorsement. So folks who take programming on information literacy can earn the teaching information literacy endorsement. And so that's what information about this is. If you have questions about this and you're interested in trying to offer something like this at your institution, please do let me know, and I'm happy to talk more about that with everyone. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing now. We're going to stay around, but just so we can kind of see each other as we're going through. Any final questions, comments, thoughts that folks would like to share? Thank you all of your comments that are coming in. Thank you all so much for being here today.